It's easy, I think, when we read Jonah chapter 1 to simply write Jonah off. To look at Jonah and what he did and shake our heads. If God actually spoke to me and told me to do something, I'd do it for sure. But Jonah needs to be something we use as a mirror. We need to look at Jonah and the massive mistakes that he makes and ask ourselves if we are like that. If we do the same as Jonah sometimes in our relationship with God, in our obedience or disobedience to him. In Jonah 1, there are two characters, other than God, there are two characters that we need to look at. The first is Jonah himself. The second are the sailors on the boat. So first, let's take a look now at Jonah. God gives him a mission. We see it in verse 1 and 2. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Now we need to understand the context here. Jonah, as we know, is an Israelite, and in his day the biggest enemy was the Assyrian Empire, and the great city of Nineveh was its capital. So understandably, Jonah had a massive problem with the Ninevites. They were not just an enemy, they were the worst of the worst. They were incredibly cruel people. They were brutal enemies who showed no mercy to others, including Jonah's people, the Israelites. One of the ways it's recorded that they punished their enemies when they captured them was to take them out into the desert, bury them alive up to their necks, and leave them in the sun to die. People would go crazy from the heat before eventually dying. So God's command to Jonah to go there, to go to Nineveh, and tell them to stop being wicked was understandably a really scary idea. It was like if someone had asked you during the middle of World War II to walk into Berlin, to knock on Hitler's front door and tell him to stop what he was doing. Or perhaps it's like if someone asked you today to jump on a plane, land in Kabul, Afghanistan, walk straight up to the Taliban soldiers and tell them to repent and follow Jesus. It probably looked like a suicide mission for Jonah. So he declines the offer. A bit more than that, actually. He runs in the complete opposite direction. We read it in verse 3. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Jonah doesn't just say no. He does whatever he can to get as far away from possible as possible. Tarshish was the other side of the known world at that time. And we don't really get a deeper understanding of why Jonah flees until chapter 4 of Jonah. But for now, in chapter 1, Jonah shows us what it looks like when we try to flee from God. It's difficult to see it sometimes in the English translation. You might be reading the NIV. But the book of Jonah is written in a very clever way with a lot of wordplay in the original Hebrew. And when chapter 1 speaks of Jonah fleeing from God, the words used over and over again depict Jonah's decision to try and flee from God's presence as this journey that leads him in one direction. Down, down, down. The wordplay is intentional. Verse 3, Jonah went down to Joppa. Verse 3 again, it says, after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish. Now the actual words there of that verse, they're better translated as, so he paid the fare and went down into the ship to go with them to Tarshish. Then verse 5, it says this, it says, all the sailors were afraid and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck. The better translation there again uses the same word, but Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship. And again in verse 5 it says, where he lay down. and fell into a deep sleep. Jonah, even though a fierce storm rages about him, he is now in a deep sleep. He has gone down, 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 almost reaching rock bottom. He has done everything within his power to try and flee from the presence of God, to ignore God's call on his life. And really, in doing this, Jonah paints a vivid picture of sinfulness, where it leads us down the path, seemingly further and further away from God. Down, down, down. See where Jonah is by just verse 5 of this chapter. He's tried to run away from God. He's actively disobeyed God. And now what is his state? He is fast asleep. A storm rages around him. I mean, look at what everyone else is doing. There's more wordplay here. You kind of miss it in the NIV translation, but it says there that God hurls a great wind upon the storm. And in response, what do the sailors do? Well, they have to throw their cargo, their livelihood overboard. Everything else is just being thrown around. The fury of God in the storm. But Jonah is indifferent. Jonah is fast asleep. And really, that's a picture of what sin can look like, isn't it? Sometimes it isn't just an active running from God like Jonah, running in the opposite direction from God's mission. Often sinfulness, my sinfulness, your sinfulness, the world's sinfulness is much more, it looks much more like Jonah asleep in the bottom of the ship. Just simply ignoring God, indifferent to God's call. Sleeping, even though up on deck, the creator of the world is pursuing him with fearsome power. Jonah runs from God, he disobeys God, he ignores God. He seems indifferent and asleep to the God who pursues him. And this is no simple game of hide and seek, is it? No, it's actually a matter of life and death. We see it here in Jonah 1, we see it throughout Jonah. The book of Jonah deals with the matter of life or death. Life or death for Jonah, life or death for these sailors, life or death for the Ninevites, and ultimately, life or death for you and me too. The matter of life and death is that we have a God who calls us to be his, to follow him. And he even pursues us with his love. We see that most clearly in how he pursues us with Christ. And if we follow him, there is life. We see that through Christ, don't we? But if we flee him, if we are indifferent to him, just like Jonah, we head down, 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 ultimately to death. Because in the end, we cannot really flee, we cannot really run away from God, can we? We cannot really flee from the God who created the entire universe. Jonah figures that out the hard way, although I think he probably already knew. And the great thing, the life-changing thing, is that we don't need to flee from God. He is the God who created us. He is the God who we see pursues us with his love. And we will see next week that for Jonah, it takes a trip in the belly of a fish to see that God is actually not one to run from. He is one to run to. And that's the same for us. He isn't one to run from, to be indifferent to ignore, to disobey. He is one who pursues us with his love. He is one for us to run to. So as I said earlier, the other main characters in Jonah chapter 1 are the sailors. You've got to feel almost sorry for them. Unknowingly, they bring on a passenger who brings with him a pursuing, fearsome God. If you look back through this chapter, you see the crazy situation that befalls these sailors. We can see how they struggle to comprehend what is happening, and they try with all their hearts to deal with it. We see them, first of all, they cry out to each of their own gods. Then we see them throw their cargo into the sea, their livelihood into the sea. We see them force Jonah to wake up and pray to his own God. They cast lots to try and figure out what is going on, who is to blame. And when that falls on Jonah, they interrogate Jonah. And even after Jonah admits guilt, they still row with all their energy to try and save the situation. But ultimately, they're given no other way than to throw Jonah overboard. He even tells them to do it. But you've got to feel sorry for them even in that, don't you? Because Jonah here, he might kind of accept guilt. Jonah finally gives them a way out, it seems. But at the same time, Jonah still doesn't deal with the consequences himself. He doesn't take it upon himself. He still demands that the sailors throw him overboard, almost trying to make them complicit, almost wishing that God might blame them as well, these pagan sailors, as much as him. But while we see in chapter 1 that Jonah still fails to grasp the picture, while Jonah still hasn't really repented, what emerges from the actions and the words of the sailors is a far better picture, an emerging picture of how to react, how to respond to God. Because here in the storm, these sailors, they seem to have some type of conversion experience. We don't know if they stuck at it. They aren't mentioned again past chapter 1. But here in chapter 1, they show us this transition from not knowing God at all to worshipping him. In many ways, it's a conversion story. Their journey to worshipping God is shown most clearly in how their fear changes in this amazing encounter with God. So look with me first back to verse 4 and 5. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. So when this storm begins, the first thing they fear, we see, is the storm itself. They have no idea who this God is that is causing it. So they collectively, they seem to hedge their bets, and they cry out to as many as gods as they can. They even wake Jonah himself up and demand that he pray to his God as well. But as the situation progresses, as their knowledge grows, their fear changes. Now take a look with me at verses 7 to 10. Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. It's amazing the contrast we see here between Jonah and the sailors. Jonah stands there and makes this grand statement about his God. "I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." So Jonah makes this big statement about his God. But in reality, his actions are saying the complete opposite, aren't they? He isn't really worshipping God. He's running away from him, or trying to ignore God. And the sailors, they're stunned when they hear this. They hear of this God who made the sea and the dry land, and they look at Jonah and they say, "You fool! What are you doing? I mean, this is a boat. We are on the sea that your God has made." Their fear shifts from a storm they think can kill them to a God, to this God who made the sea and the land, to this God who they think is going to kill them. But that is not where the fear ends. Fear of the Lord does not end with living under a God who we are afraid could just kill us at any moment. No, we see as we read on in Jonah 1 that as soon as Jonah is thrown overboard, the raging sea grows calm. The Lord stops his assault on the boat and the sailors. His wrath is seemingly calmed. But when that happens, this doesn't cause the sailors to simply sigh relief and then go on their merry way, forgetting this amazing encounter with God. No, as much as they feared God, as much as they feared the God who brought the storm, as much as they feared the God who seemed to be bringing death, now, even more, they fear the God who calmed the storm. They fear the God who brought them out of death into life. Look at verse 16. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Let's be honest, Jonah here in chapter 1 at least is a pretty pathetic witness, isn't he? But our sovereign Lord is still at work. Jonah was totally against the idea of the Ninevites even getting a sniff of chance to escape God's judgment. And we're going to explore that more in the next few chapters. But what we see here is that despite Jonah's disobedience, even through Jonah's disobedience, God works to reveal himself to others. God works to offer rescue instead of judgment, not yet to the Ninevites, but now to the sailors. He offers grace instead of punishment. And while there is plenty more in the adventures of Jonah to discover about the depths of God's grace, chapter 1 leaves us, like Jonah, like the sailors, with the question of how we are going to respond to God. Will you go down the road of disobedience? Will you go down the road of indifference to the Lord? Or will you, like the sailors, give him the fear that he deserves? We do not fear him as a God who could just unpredictably give up on us and do away with us on a whim. Because that is not in his faithfulness, his character. No, we fear him as the holy God, the fearsome God, who offers to rescue us from our failings, who offers us the depth of his grace through his one and only Son. We fear, we worship the Lord, who we cannot escape, we cannot flee from him. But actually, we shouldn't want to. We shouldn't want to flee from him. We shouldn't want to try and escape him, because he is our creator, and even more than that, he is our gracious deliverer and saviour.